This is the Mezzotint, a ghost story by M.R. James, retold for you this winter's night as part of my Christmas series here on the Wanderlust Way. Settle in, let the room grow still, and allow the story to unfold. There are stories that come upon one quietly, like a draught through a closed room. At first you barely notice them. Then, before long, you realise you have grown cold without knowing when it happened. This is such a story, and it begins in the orderly, lamp-lit rooms of Mr. Williams, curator of the art museum of a well-known Cambridge college. A practical man, careful in his work, and with no patience at all for tales of the supernatural. One winter afternoon, Williams received a parcel from a London art dealer with whom he frequently did business. A man named Britnell, a respected purveyor of old prints. The parcel contained a single mezzotint, accompanied by a note explaining that Williams might find the subject within his province. Williams slit open the package without much excitement, expecting nothing more than a dull, topographical view of some estate or manor. Such things appeared regularly in his correspondence. But when he unfolded the brown paper, he frowned, not in displeasure, but in puzzlement. The print was large, expertly executed, and unmistakably old. It showed the facade of a country house, a long, formal building of the 17th century, with a central doorway, rows of windows, clipped lawns, and an arrangement of young trees on either side. A perfectly respectable composition. Nothing amiss, nothing remarkable. Except that the lower left corner of the scene looked peculiarly dark. Not merely shaded, but dense, as though the mezzotint had caught the shadow at a strange moment. Williams assumed it was a fault, an area where the plate had been overworked or the ink unevenly applied. He set the print aside, intending to write to Britnell later, and he thought no more of it. That evening, two of his colleagues, Professor Nisbet and Mr. Garwood, came to Williams's room after dinner, as they often did. The conversation turned to art, then recent acquisitions, and finally to the new mezzotint. Williams fetched it from his desk and laid it under the lamp. Nisbet bent over it at once. "Odd," he said. "Was that figure there earlier?" "Figure?" Williams repeated. But now he saw it. In the lower left corner of the print, the part he had taken for a floor, was a shape, a human shape unmistakably, yet so faintly rendered that one could have easily have missed it altogether. It appeared to be a man standing at the edge of the lawn, half turned toward the house. His posture, though, was strange, neither walking nor waiting, but something between the two, as though caught in the very moment of approaching. William stared perplexed. "I could have sworn," he said slowly, "that this corner was empty when I examined it this afternoon." Nisbet smiled at his expression, assuming it was a trick of memory. They spoke of the print for a few minutes more, then they moved on to other matters. But when the two friends had gone, Williams's curiosity returned. He took up the mezzotint again, holding it close to the lamp. There could be no doubt the dark patch now held the outline of a man, shaded, indistinct, but certainly present. Puzzled, William set the print on the side table and went to bed, thinking he would examine it again in the morning. The next day passed in lectures and cataloguing, and it was not until near dusk that Williams remembered the mezzotint and drew it once more from its frame. And here he gave a sudden exclamation. The figure was no longer standing. It was crouching, low against the ground on hands and knees, or what resembled hands and knees, creeping across the lawn toward the house. There was something dreadful in the attitude, a kind of stealth, a purpose. Its head was lowered, its limbs unnaturally long, and one felt instinctively that this was not a human approaching a doorway, but something more akin to a predator crossing open ground while its prey remained unsuspecting inside. Williams felt an involuntary shiver. He summoned Garwood at once. Garwood arrived, glanced at the mezzotint, and grew very still. "That," he said quietly, "that was not there yesterday." The two men examined the print with mounting unease. The shading was perfect, the platework delicate. This was no modern trick or alteration. Yet the creeping figure looked as though it had always belonged to the composition. "What will it show tomorrow?" Garwood murmured. They could not guess, but both men felt, without saying it aloud, that the thing was moving with intention, stage by stage, nearer to the house. On the third evening, several friends gathered in Williams's rooms, for by now the tale had spread through the college, and curiosity had sharpened into apprehension. The mezzotint lay on the table, covered by a cloth. The lamps were lit. No one spoke much while they waited for Williams to reveal the next stage. At last he lifted the cloth. A hush fell. The creeping figure had vanished. But this was no comfort, for one of the house's lower windows, previously shut, now stood wide open, the curtains stirring faintly as though in a breeze. What had entered through that dark aperture could not be seen, but every man in the room felt the same instinctive dread. It was inside. Professor Nisbet was the first to speak. "Whatever has gone in there," he said softly, "it is not idle." The men looked at one another unsettled. In the empty foreground of the lawn, nothing moved, nothing waited, all was stillness. But the open window was like a wound in the picture, and the imagination could not help but slip inside, wondering what was happening in the darkness of that silent room. "Tomorrow," said Williams. "Tomorrow we shall know more." On the fourth and final night, the group gathered again. There was a tension in the room, the sort that precedes the ending of a grim tale when no one knows the conclusion, cannot be anything but dreadful. Williams uncovered the mezzotint. Several men drew back sharply. For crossing the lawn, away from the house now, was the figure. No longer creeping, no longer indistinct. It moved upright, striding with long, terrible purpose, and in its arms, held close against its chest, was a child. The expression, if it could be called such, on the creature's face was one of triumphant malice. The child's small form lay limp, its features smudged by the mezzotint shading, but unmistakably human. A nausea swept through the room. No one spoke for several seconds. It was not until the initial horror subsided that Williams forced himself to look more carefully at the background, at the house itself, and the trees and the sky rendered in soft mezzotint gradients, all unchanged. Only the figure and its dreadful burden had altered. "It is a sequence," Williams said hoarsely. "A record." "But of what?" Garwood whispered. The answer came soon after. Through old records, local archives, and the recollections of scholars familiar with the countryside, Williams and his colleagues uncovered the grim history of the house depicted in the print. A family named Gawdy had once owned the estate. Generations had lived and died there, their lineage long and respectable, until tragedy destroyed it. Years earlier, a poacher had been caught on the Gawdy land. A desperate man hardened by poverty, but a man nonetheless. The younger Gawdy, however, master of the house at the time, had shown no mercy. The poacher was hanged without pity, his body buried somewhere on the estate grounds. But the dead do not always lie quiet, for the poacher had left behind a son, a boy who witnessed his father's execution and grew into a man with vengeance in his heart. Years later, he returned under the cover of darkness, not for theft, not for escape, but for the child, the infant heir to the Gawdy name. He took the child from its cradle and carried it out across the lawn, just as the Mezzotint had shown, and the child was never seen again. The younger Gordy, broken by grief, lost his wits. The family line dwindled and ended soon after. When this explanation was laid before them, the men in Williams's rooms looked again at the changing print and the dreadful sequence it had revealed. The tale was awful, but it explained nothing, and yet in some way, impossible to articulate, it seemed to explain everything. For now, it is enough to say that Williams never again regarded the art of Mezzotint with the casual indifference he once possessed. One thing is for sure, from that night on, Williams kept the print locked away. He recorded it in the museum's records, but he never looked at it again. But sometimes, when the evenings were long and the wind tapped at the window panes, he could not help but wonder whether the scene had changed once more, and what new stage might be waiting for those who dared lift the cloth.